Known for a while now that the big crossover event in the CWDC shows next year, or this year now, I guess, is going to be Crisis on Infinite Earths, based on the classic crossover event in the comics from 1985 that kind of boiled down all of the stuff they'd written up to that point into one coherent setting. And I am not a big comics guy per se. I love all the TV shows. I like a lot of comic book movies, but comic books themselves, I've never really gotten that much into. So I'd never read this thing, and I was not familiar at all about what went into it. But then DC Universe comes out, their streaming service with shows like Titans and Doom Patrol and Swamp Thing and whatever else. And another big part of that is if you sign up, you get access to literally the entire DC Comics, like all of them going back to the 20s and 30s. And so this is a huge thing for someone like me where you don't actually have to track down those things and you don't have to pay that much more for them. So I figured this gives me a look at Crisis on Infinite Earths, a way to read it to prepare myself before we get the actual crossover on the CW next season. So I should maybe just give my thoughts on each issue. There's 12 of them, as someone who is not that into comics but is into like all the CW shows and the cartoons from the 90s, what have you. That's how I know these characters, and that could provide kind of an interesting viewpoint for maybe anyone else who's in the same boat as me and is wondering what exactly they should know going into this thing. So I've now read issue number one, and it is really just a first issue. It's all about gathering all these characters together who have all just been in their own books, most of them, I guess, and just telling them, hey, there's this big thing going on. We're going to need all of you. And I gather that this was a pretty novel thing for comics at the time, even with like Avengers dating back to the 60s and maybe Justice League sometime in the same thing. But even that was not like literally all the comics coming together like this does. So that was probably pretty neat to see. And it all centers on this character named Harbinger, who I imagine was just introduced right here because we get a whole big dump of her backstory. And it's like it does the job. It's a bit bare bones. Like she was just this orphan baby taken in by the Monitor, who just oversees all the different universes. And now she does anything he asks, although she's not that happy about it. And it's also kind of unclear if she's a good or a bad guy because she mostly acts as a hero because she's trying to stop like all these worlds from being disintegrated. But there's also these references to her like cruel lips at one point, and she's like a bit nastier than she kind of needs to be. So it'll be interesting to see what side she falls down on there. And for the people she brings together, and I'll be referring to this rather convenient splash page. If I can just get it on there, that the comic book sets up. That is what I'll be referring to like kind of jog my memory about everyone who is involved in this thing. Well, there's Superman, of course, although the interesting thing with that is he's an older version. Like he's gray around the temples, and Harbinger even references that he's older than she was expecting. So I'm guessing he's not from the main setting, and that'll probably turn into it somehow. And I've never really seen that much about an older Superman before, so that should be a new one for me. And there's also people I recognize from the DC shows, like Firestorm, who is the Robbie Reyes version at this point. And there's Green Lantern, of course, John Stewart, who Diggle was just recently confirmed to be that show's version of. There's some I've never heard before, like Dr. Polaris, who I'm guessing is a bad guy from the way he's acting, and Simon, starting with a P, who I'm guessing has like these mind powers. And well, the neat thing is, like, they're all drawn together, and then they get in this big fight. And the fight itself is not really that much special because it's against these shadow creatures who we have no personalities. They all look the same, and we have no reason to care about them. But it's I'm guessing just because they figured we're throwing all these things together, people might not be aware of all of them, and there's no internet back then even to look this stuff up. So we better throw them into something that can show what each of them can do. And it does the job there. But easily the standout for me of all the heroes who've been brought together here is Blue Beetle. I've heard of him before. Like people these DC comics really seem to like him. They recommend him all the time, but I'd never actually read any of his stuff before. But he is a blast. Like he's kind of the Spider-Man of the group. He's always has these wisecracks ready, and for the most part, they're pretty well written. My favorite is that, like, I can't remember the exact line, but Harbinger just comes to him and says, "We need you to take part in this," and his response is pretty much, "Well, there's nothing on TV tonight, so I guess I might as well." Like, this guy gets me. And also worth noting here is, oh yeah, the one kind of sour note of the whole thing is that they bring in Killer Frost, who I gather it from the way people have been talking about the version of her that's on The Flash. In the comics, she is just a straight up villain. Like there's no kind of hero and sharing her mind or whatever kind of weird thing they have going on there. I've never really understood it, but the comics, she's just a bad guy, and the way they get her involved is she's put under a spell to make her think she's in love with Firestorm, and that is obviously uncomfortable as hell. And this is even just a few years after Avengers number 200, the one where Ms. Marvel was raped, and we're supposed to appreciate it and like it. But, I'm hoping this goes somewhere that will make this a bit less uncomfortable, at least, because from just this issue alone, it seems the idea we're supposed to have is she's a bad guy, so it's okay. And, that it's really not doing it for me at this point. Like, there's even a bunch of jokes cracked about how, like, Firestorm is uncomfortable kissing her, not because it's wrong to like kiss someone who doesn't have consent, but just because it's icky that it's her. And that is not aged well at all. But that it doesn't take up much space here. I'm hoping desperately that it goes somewhere that's worth it. And so that's pretty much all that happens in this issue. It's not much plot happening, just the introduction of this universe. Oh, and one more thing I should point out is we start on Earth 3, which is a place where all the heroes are villains, and the one superhero around is Lex Luthor, and he sends his baby son out in an obvious parallel to Superman's own origin story, and now he's just floating around the multiverse somewhere waiting to be taken in. But that is really notable primarily because we just met this guy, we're given no reason to care about him, and yet it's still very moving to see his the destruction of his world just because of how well written it is. And comic books at the time, they were not exactly well known for being very deep. So like this was the same year that Watchmen came out and was really threw everyone's ideas of what comics could be out the window. And like that was when people really started taking it seriously, as far as I understand it. But stuff like the destruction of Earth 3, that is like some deep stuff, and it really makes you feel for like this whole world that's being lost, even though you know nothing about it. And if they can keep that kind of stuff up, this should really be something special, and I get why people still love it this much. But it's pretty good introduction, just with that one kind of caveat. But I'm still have high hopes for this going forward, and I'll be with you to see what I think of the rest of it, and I'll see you all there.